And thanks very much. Obviously just a small group, so shout out if you can't hear me, if I get too excited and speak too fast, just let me know. It takes me a year to think of a subject because I don't do very much speaking. So it was a year ago that I think I was talking to you, and as you know, it's a slot I inherited off my father. I thought it was for a year, but you keep inviting me back. There you go. There's three I do round about the same time, this time of year. So you're the first. So I'll see how it goes this time, and then maybe tweak it so you can help me out in that respect. So as I say, it's quite difficult to think of a subject, and I was thinking about something about prophecy, and thinking, well, who is prophecy for? And it can be a warning, can't it? It can be a warning to the people of the day. I mean, think about Adam and Eve. It was a warning to them. If you eat from this tree, you're going to die. So there was a warning there. Tells you something that you shouldn't do, maybe. Or what it can do as well, and we find, is that it reinforces, I think, our belief. So when we see prophecies coming true, things coming true, I think that it can help us. Help to strengthen our faith. And I think I certainly have times when I struggle with my faith, and I'm not ashamed to admit that, because I know that there'd be people like Peter who didn't always walk on the water, and Thomas who had some doubts. So I think that we're probably all in the same boat. So I'm largely going to be looking at things that I think can strengthen our faith tonight through the prophecy, Joseph the prophet. And it's been really helpful to me, because it genuinely has helped me in that respect. So we're going to start looking at by looking at Genesis chapter 37, and we're going to do that in a bit of detail. And then we're going to just have a bit of a look at the rest of Joseph's life. And then we're going to conclude with something that's, I think, is really important, that's been put in the Bible for us to see at the end of Joseph's life, that helps us in our lives. So we'll come on to that thirdly. Now, my dad, he used to like his acronyms. So I think that's the word. So that's the word, isn't it? So he used to talk about BBC. So we're all of an age where we know the BBC. So we don't have to talk about YouTube and things like that. But BBC, so it would be believe, be baptized, and change your life. And that's stuck with me. And I think that the stronger your belief, the first belief, the easier it is, or the more likely you are to change your life and focus your activity on changing your life to do the things that God would want us to do. So I think doing a talk like this about strengthening our belief is useful. You probably will know a lot of the things that I'm going to say, but I can tell you, when I was going through them, I'd never imagined there'd be so many things that would be there, as you'll see when we go through this. And what we're looking at is, we're going to be looking at the comparison between Jesus's life and Joseph's life. And there's so many links that really it just couldn't have been put there by man. There's absolutely no doubt that it couldn't have been. And I'm sure that when Jesus talks to his disciples after his resurrection, and we read in Luke 24 that he opened their minds so that they could understand the scriptures and see the things written about him in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. I'm sure that Joseph would have absolutely blown them away when he explained that to them. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through chapter 37, as I say, for the first third, talking in a bit of detail. So we've read it. And let's start there then. And so I'm reading from the NIV, because I think it's a nice, easy to understand version for this context. So that's what I'm doing. And we're going to pick out some verses. And really what we're looking for is links between Jesus and Joseph in a way that couldn't possibly have been put there by anybody other than God. So we start off and we find Jacob. He's named Jacob there. He lives in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. And we learn of Joseph, a young man of 17. He's tending the flocks with his brothers. And he brought their father a bad report about them. So we find that Joseph is tending the flocks. He was a shepherd. And what's more than that, he's brought a bad report about his brothers. So you could say that he's the good shepherd, perhaps. So there's a link there, but I think if we were just going to make links like that, you maybe would say that's a little bit tenuous. I'm not sure that proves the point at this stage, but we'll keep going. So verse 3. Now Israel, so we get the name Israel given to us there. Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, and he made him an ornate robe, didn't he? Well, we know from Matthew 3 that Jesus' father loved him, but that's not unusual, is it really? I mean, it's not always the case, but if we're looking for these links, that's not necessarily going to be something that we would say, well, this proves that there's a link here between Joseph and Jesus, because God loved Jesus and he was his son, and Israel loves Joseph. But I think it's interesting here that we're given the name Israel, because we're then told Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. And effectively, we're learning about the children of Israel here. So the children of Israel. So if there is a link between the life of Joseph and that of Jesus, then this is going to likely be an important connection, because the children of Israel behaved in a certain way towards Joseph, and the children of Israel behaved in a certain way towards Jesus. So let's see how they did behave. Verse 4. So his brothers hated him, and they could not speak a kind word to him. And then it gets a bit worse, doesn't it, in verse 5, when Joseph has this dream. So he sees the future, and he tells them a dream in which they're going to bow down to him. And they say, well, verse 8, do you intend to reign over us? Well, in Luke chapter 19, Jesus tells a parable about the future kingdom of God, because he, like Joseph, can see what's going to happen in the future. And in this parable, the subjects hate hate effectively, it's Jesus that he's talking about. He's talking a parable about himself. And the children of Israel say, we don't want this man to be our king. So there's a link there in that parable. The children of Israel here that we can see, they clearly hate Joseph. Joseph is able to see the future, but they don't want him to reign over them. So just to make sure you're on the right track, Ria, with what I'm doing then, I'm looking for a comparison between the two, and here's a quick recap. So at this stage, there's already quite a lot going on, really. Joseph was a good shepherd. His brothers, the children of Israel, were bad. Joseph's father loved him, but the children of Israel could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph sees the future in which he will rule over them, but they reject him. So let's see what happens next then. So if we go to verse 12. Now, it seems to me that there's quite a lot of detail here in verses 12 to 16 about this little incident where Joseph goes out to find, he's sent out by his father to his brothers. And it seems odd when I read it why there was that much detail. Now, there might be something in the fact that he went to Shechem and then he went to Dothan. But what we find is that he goes off and he goes to look for them. And verse 15, when Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? So he was looking for something, because it wasn't where he was expecting it to be. So you could say that he was looking for the children of Israel, or he was looking for the lost sheep of Israel, possibly. And it's interesting that Jesus said when he sends the 12 disciples out in Matthew chapter 10, he gives them these specific instructions: go to the lost sheep of Israel. And then in Matthew chapter 15, where he's with the Canaanite woman who had a lot of faith, if you remember, and he heals her daughter, he says to her, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. Okay, when they see him, when he finds them, verse 18, and they see him in the distance, they plot to kill him. I think there's a fairly obvious link there between Joseph and Jesus. So they plot to kill him. And then there's another little link here, which you might think is pushing it a bit. And generally speaking, I don't like it when people in talks push it, because it kind of ruins the whole argument as far as I'm concerned. But what happens is I've got to the end of all these comparisons, and there's so many really obvious ones that I've reached the point where I've thought, if I'm seeing something here, it's going to be there. There is a comparison. So, verse 21, when Reuben heard this, so they want to kill him, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Now, there's somebody in Jesus' life, again, maybe stretching it a little bit, as I say, perhaps like Pilate, who tries to rescue him, tries to rescue Jesus from their hands. But I'll let you reserve judgment on that one. Don't let that, if you think that's tenuous, don't let that ruin your belief in what I'm saying. So verse 23, so when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, just as Jesus in Matthew 27, at the crucifixion, he was stripped of his robe. And they took him and threw him into the cistern, or into a pit. And the pit was empty. We're told there was no water in it. So if you've not got any water, you're going to die after 3 days. So a similarity there, obviously, with Jesus being put in a pit and did die. Then again, we get one of these little sections in this chapter where we get a little bit more detail than you might expect. So they sit down, verse 25, they sat down to eat their meal. How horrible were they? And they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. So we've got these camels. Their camels, it tells us what their camels were loaded with. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. So we're given this bit of detail. And it's interesting that obviously Joseph being in the pit, Jesus dying, around the time of Jesus' death, these 3 things also appear around about the time of Jesus' death. So he's anointed with expensive perfume at Bethany. Then at his crucifixion, they offered Jesus wine mixed with myrrh. And then after his death, Mary and Salome brought spices so they might anoint Jesus' body. So they're kind of mounting up, aren't they, these comparisons? So we'll go back to Genesis 37, verse 26 here. And we read that Judah said to his brothers, "What will we kill our brother? What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him." So when the Midianite merchants come by, they sell him for 20 shekels of silver, 20 pieces of silver. Well, in Jesus' life, of course, it's not Judah, but it's Judas who sells Jesus for, in that case, 30 pieces of silver. Now, before we go on and see what happens next in this chapter, I just want us to go to Leviticus chapter 16. So in Leviticus chapter 16, we are learning about the Day of Atonement. So the Day of Atonement, the one day in the year in which the high priest would enter the most holy place, and there was a process by which he would make atonement for, or a process by which the sins of the people would be carried away. And we know from the New Testament in Hebrews that this is a foreshadowing of the sacrifice of Jesus, by which we can have our sins taken away. But in this process, if we just have a little look at it, what happens is in chapter 16 and verse 5, we see that Aaron from the Israelite community takes 2 male goats for a sin offering. And then verse 7, he's going to take the 2 goats and he's going to present them before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He's going to cast lots for the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord and the other for the scapegoat. And then Aaron shall bring the goat whose lot falls to the Lord and sacrifice it for a sin offering. But the goat chosen by Lot as the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord to be used for making atonement by sending it into the wilderness as a scapegoat. So as the process, there's these two goats. One's killed, and we learn that its blood in verses 15 and 19, its blood is sprinkled. So one goat's killed, and the other one is alive and is led away into the wilderness. Now, amazingly, when we go back to Genesis chapter 37, we find that Joseph, who's alive, is taken out of the pit alive, and he is, in verse 28, he's led away effectively into the wilderness, isn't he? He's taken away by these Ishmaelites and their camels, and he's taken to Egypt. So that's one of the goats, perhaps. So where's the other goat? So verse 31, so they're trying to make up a reason, aren't they? They're trying to explain Joseph's death now. So verse 31, they got Joseph's robe, and they slaughtered a goat, and they dipped the robe in the blood. So you've got your two goats there, one taken away into the wilderness and one killed with its blood sprinkled. So just another quick recap then. So Joseph goes after the lost sheep of Israel, but they see him, they plot to kill him, and they put him in a pit. But he doesn't die, does he? He should die, but he comes out alive, and then surrounded by myrrh and bar and spices. Just like in the goat in the Day of Atonement, he's led away into the wilderness, and there's another goat, like the Day of Atonement, is killed, and its blood is sprinkled. So I think that chapter 37 of Genesis is telling us to look closely at the life of Jesus to see what we can find, to see what comparisons we can find. And there's more. And I think that because God's put them there for us to have a look at, I think we ought to have a look and have our faith strengthened. Because as I say, it's helped me. Now, it's not quite as compact as in chapter 37. So chapter 38 isn't really following the story of Joseph. But then we get to chapter 39, and then I'm going to dip into the story of Joseph, and we're going to be finding comparisons. And some of the things I will say in passing, and you might think to yourself, oh yes, Jesus, that sounds like Jesus as well. And some of them I'll just point to and say, well, some of them will just be part of the story. And some of them I'll say, well, yeah, I think there's a comparison there. But it's your choice. So chapter 39, verse 1. So Joseph's been taken down to Egypt. And Potiphar, an Egyptian who's one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. So Joseph effectively becomes a servant, and we know that his master is pleased with him. Then in verse 2, we know that the Lord was with Joseph. I think the Lord was with Jesus. And he gets put in charge, verse 4, of Potiphar's household. And we get to verse 7, and we know that Joseph is handsome, a handsome young man, and he's tempted, isn't it? His master's wife wants to sleep with him, so he's tempted by her in that respect. And though she came to Joseph day after day, in verse 10, I don't know that it was 40 days, but I wouldn't be surprised. He didn't sin, did he? Even though he was tempted, he didn't sin. And then in verse 14, he's just as Jesus was. He's falsely accused, and he's put in prison. We get then to chapter 40, and while he's in prison, Pharaoh puts the chief cupbearer, verse 1, and the baker into prison with him. So he's there surrounded by seems like a representation of the bread and the wine. There's another allusion to part of Jesus's life there, isn't there? So Pharaoh puts the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in prison with Joseph. And they both have dreams on the same night. And Joseph interprets the dreams, round about verses 12 to 19. And he gives two different answers. To the cupbearer, he says, within 3 days, interesting that it's 3 days, within 3 days, Pharaoh will restore you to your future position. So what he says is in 3 days, you're going to live. But to the baker, he says, again, within 3 days, he says, within 3 days, you're going to die. I think there's a similarity here between Joseph and Jesus on the cross, being surrounded by two people, and one of them is hurling insults at Jesus and saying, save yourself and us, because he knows he's going to die. And the other one, Jesus tells him that he's going to live effectively, doesn't he? So there's a comparison there. And maybe we would have thought, well, that's a bit of a coincidence, but it doesn't mean anything. But there's so many coincidences that I think I've started looking at it kind of the other way and thinking, well, what am I missing in the life of Joseph? Because there's so many. So we go then into chapter 41. And this time Pharaoh has a dream, or two dreams, and they trouble him. And nobody can interpret these dreams, can they? But the cupbearer, who Joseph's interpreted his dream while he's in prison, he remembers that Joseph can interpret dreams, and Joseph is called for, and he says, well, it's God who can interpret the dream. And then chapter 41, verses around about 20, let's have a look, around about verses 29. He explains that there's going to be 7 years of great abundance all over the land, and then there's going to be 7 years of famine that are going to follow them. And then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. So I think there that what Joseph, or perhaps Jesus, what Joseph is saying is, you're all going to die, effectively. You're going to have these years of abundance, but then there's going to be this year of famine. You're going to be ravaged. Do you know what? You're all going to die. Probably a bit like Joseph saying, Jesus saying the wages of sin is death. We're going to die, aren't we? And verse 33, Pharaoh says, well, let's look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. So Joseph comes up with, verse 33, he comes up with this plan of what they can do. Well, he said, this is this plan, what you can do. What you need to do is you need to store up the grain. I mean, we know the story. We need to store up the grain in the good years so that you've got the grain ready for the bad years. It sounds a bit like the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, possibly in Matthew 25. You're storing up this grain. Or put another way, Joseph explains what's going to happen. He says, you're all going to die. You're all going to die. However, I've got a plan of salvation whereby you can all live. Sounds familiar to me. Sounds like Jesus, and he gets put in charge of the land. And interesting coincidence or otherwise. So how old do you think, how old was Joseph? How old was Jesus when he explained his plan of salvation for the world? And how old was Joseph when he came up with his plan? If you get to verse 46 of the chapter 41, you'll find that Joseph, like Jesus, was 30 years old when he starts and this begins. Okay. And then verses 53 to 57, the end of the chapter, we find that the famine starts. And again, another comparison to Jesus. We see that to actually live, people have got to come. They come from all over the whole country. Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And then people come from around the world, and he's selling this grain. Joseph absolutely, literally is the bread of life, as is Jesus. Okay, I'm just going to have a look at my clock because let's have a look. Okay, then. All right, then. So, to recap then. So, in the life of Joseph, we see that, well, and in Jesus, we see Joseph is the good shepherd. We see his father loved him. But the children of Israel hated and plotted to kill him, and they didn't want him to rule over them. Then, although he was sold by Judas and buried in a pit, he came out of the pit alive, fulfilling his role of sacrifice. So this is Jesus fulfilling his role of sacrifice as foreshadowed on the Day of Atonement. So Jesus and Joseph, they're tempted, but they didn't sin. They're 30 when they explain that the people would die, but that they have a plan of salvation for the world. And he was the bread of life. He was the only way that they could be saved. So I think that as with Genesis chapter 37, we're being told that this isn't something that could have happened by chance. So I would say, as a helpful prophecy, it's something that is there to strengthen our faith. I look at it, I just cannot believe that it's there, really. It's just such a strong comparison. Right then, so we're moving on then. So this is the next bit then. This is the final third. So now that we've got this link so that we can see that Joseph and Jesus are linked, I think we're then told something important that should affect our lives today. So me and you, it's something that's there for us, that's been put there for us to look at. So the whole world is coming to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, we know. And that's included Joseph's brothers. That's got to be us, hasn't it? Because we're Jesus's brothers. So I think this final section of the talk, I think it's about us and about how we should approach Jesus in our lives, perhaps at the breaking of bread, perhaps in our day-to-day lives, because there's been so many links so far. Why wouldn't this be something that's relevant to us? So chapter 42, verse 7. So his brothers, they come and they bow down to Joseph. Chapter 42, verse 7. And Joseph recognizes them. So they come to worship, maybe a little bit like we might do on a Sunday morning. And what he does is he tests them. So in verses 13 to 20, he comes up with this test. And he wants them, he asks them, and he finds out about Benjamin from them. And he wants them to bring Benjamin back to him. So he's testing them. And in verse 21, you see the conversation that they have with themselves. And they say, surely we're being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was. This is how distressed Joseph was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us. The distress is that they're going to have to bring Benjamin back to them, and they don't want to do that. And we see in verse 23, they don't realize that Joseph could understand them. Because why would they? He's using an interpreter. So they don't realize. So effectively, they've come before Joseph and they've got a secret. There's something that they're holding back. But they're not really, are they? Because Joseph knows all about it and he can understand them, even though they think that they're keeping it from him. So Joseph keeps Simeon and he sends them back, and he does something else. What he does is they've come to buy grain from him at this point, and he hides their silver. He puts it back in their bags. So when they go, the money that they've bought to buy the grain with, it's in their bags, and they're really scared about this. And eventually when they run out of food and they come back for Simeon and they come back with Benjamin, what they do is they bring back a double amount of silver, because they're like, well, what happened here? But in another comparison, when we get to chapter 43, verse 23, or 22, here they are, they're sort of explaining to the man who's receiving them at this point, because they've come back for some more food. He says, look, we've brought additional silver with us to buy food, because we don't know who put our silver in our sacks. We don't know how that happened. And he says to them, he says, it's all right. Don't be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver. He's basically saying to them, no, it's fine. Don't think that you didn't pay for the grain. Somebody's paid for it. There must have been a miracle or something, because if that's what you think, because that price has already been paid. A bit like Jesus has paid the price for us. So the bread of life that they received, it was free. This miracle had happened. And they come and they bow down in front of Joseph, and he talks to them. And they, interesting, they share a meal with him. That feels a bit like Sunday morning to me. They share a meal with him. And in verse 32, they're having this food, and we're given another little bit of interesting detail here. And it's that the Egyptians don't eat with them, because Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews. That is detestable to Egyptians. Seems like at this breaking of bread service, or at this this meal, it's just God's people who are there. And at the meal, they've been, verse 33, they've been seated in age order, because Joseph knows them all individually. He knows when they were born, like maybe Jesus knows the date of our baptism. And then he can't hold it in anymore, can he? So he cries out in chapter 45. He tells them who he is. Jesus tells them who he is. He's a man of compassion. And he tells them, don't be distressed or angry, because he's forgiven them. And he explains that God sent him ahead of them. It was God's predetermined plan, or to quote Acts chapter 2, where Peter says, this man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. And carrying on there, Acts 2, God raised Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it, just as the brothers there are all witnesses of Joseph being alive. And in chapter 45, verse 22, he gives them new clothing. I'll leave you to, I think there might be some comparison there to what happens in Revelation. And there we go. We've got the life of Joseph. I mean, I've heard people say, yeah, he's a type of Christ. And I think, yeah, okay, yeah, there's going to be some similarities. But when I started looking, I just couldn't believe it, the amount that there were, and the comparisons. I haven't even told you all of them. And I'm sure that if I was to look at the life of Jesus and then come back again, I would find other ones and think, well, yeah, those are there. I won't say them now. I could do. But if we can see these similarities, to me, if we can see these similarities in the life of Jesus and the life of Joseph, I think that God has put that there. He's put that there for a couple of reasons. He's put it there to tell us something, isn't he? To tell us that it couldn't have been put there by man. It strengthens my faith. And then when I'm on board, I've got a stronger faith, and I want to change my life, I can look at this and I can think to myself, so what does it tell me then about my relationship with Jesus going forward? And this final part of it talks about, well, the brothers coming to Jesus, they come to Joseph, and he knows all about them, and he's forgiven them. And in the same way, you know, Jesus knows all of our secrets. There's no point trying to hide them. And they recognize their guilt, and they're forgiven. I think there's got to be a strong comparison there, which will be helpful for me going to Sunday mornings and believing that I can be forgiven if I want to be forgiven. So thanks for listening.